So accuracy and integrity are the two key words that I focused on throughout the testimony, and I provided examples of inaccuracies in our current system, such as the fact that we currently have over 380,000 fewer voters than ballots cast in the 2020 election. That's kind of a big deal. And the fact that our voter history data changes every single month is kind of a big deal. When you have a chief election official that has utter contempt for the rule of law like that, it's very difficult to have confidence in the results of election. Matter of fact, one of the most compelling parts of the testimony, I'm told, has to do with when I showed a clip of Jocelyn Benson's own attorney, Heather Meingast, testifying before the Michigan Court of Appeals in the O'Halloran v. Benson case. And in her testimony, she effectively said that the Secretary of State only follows the laws that she agrees with. And I can tell you, I personally have gotten a 2 terabyte drive of evidence that we've collected over the last 5 years from meddling kids all over the place into the hands of folks in D.C. So I think what you're starting to see now with the revelations coming out of Tulsi Gabbard, with some of the letters that are going out to secretaries of state from the Department of Justice, you're starting to see a renewed appreciation for the fact that, guys, we've been telling the truth since day one. Time to take it seriously. Let's dig into this.
The Karamo Report. Pursuing the truth. Dissolving the complexities of religion, culture, and politics.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Karamo Report. This week, we'll be talking with former Michigan State Senator, Mr. Pat Colbeck. We'll be discussing the future of the election integrity movement. I know for many people, it's kind of like everything is great. Our people won. Well, no, that's not the case. Our election systems are still very corrupt, and it is a matter of national survival that we clean up our election system. So we're going to discuss the status of the election system and how do we move forward. And we're going to talk about cleaning up the swamp. So everyone, please say hello to Mr. Pat Colbeck. Pat, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Christina.
So, Pat, recently you testified before the Michigan House Election Integrity Committee, and we're going to make sure that we have that testimony on our website, thecaramoreport.com, so people can watch it, because you do a really good job of taking something as complex and tedious as our election system, which, just stating for the record, our election system should not be this complex. I believe it's been intentionally made overly complex by design so they can insert corruption that the average citizen can't detect. With that being said, you do a really great job of taking a very complex topic and simplifying it so the average person could understand. If you could you just summarize briefly your testimony before the Election Integrity Committee at the Michigan House?
Yeah, perhaps the best way to simplify matters is to go back to first principles, and that means going back to our Constitution. So the whole testimony was based on Article 2, Section 4 of the Michigan Constitution, which guarantees us the ability to have an election system where we can determine whether or not it's accurate, and it was conducted, and any given election was conducted with integrity. So accuracy and integrity are the two key words that I focused on throughout the testimony, and I provided examples of inaccuracies in our current system, such as the fact that we currently have over 380,000 fewer voters than ballots cast in the 2020 election. That's kind of a big deal. And the fact that our voter history data changes every single month is kind of a big deal. And the fact that we actually report out on our election results in decimals instead of integers for votes, because somebody wants to use fractions again for our votes, and that tees it up for electronic manipulation very nicely. And then when you start getting into the integrity, it starts with the chief election official of the state, Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who's been found by no less than 7 courts to have issued unlawful guidance to our election officials. And so when you have a chief election official that has utter contempt for the rule of law like that, it's very difficult to have confidence in the results of election. Matter of fact, one of the most compelling parts of the testimony, I'm told, has to do with when I showed a clip of Jocelyn Benson's own attorney, Heather Meingast, testifying before the Michigan Court of Appeals in the O'Halloran v. Benson case. And in her testimony, she effectively said that the Secretary of State only follows the laws that she agrees with. And if you don't like that, you can go off and sue her. Well, that's not the way it's supposed to work. That's willful neglect of duty, and she took an oath to support the Constitution, and she failed to do it. So that's, in a nutshell. I went through like 18 different examples where there's lack of integrity in our election system, and I only provided 15 slides, but I had almost 150 slides as backup. So if anybody wanted to explore any one of them, we have the receipts.
It's funny, Pat. I think to your point with her attorney saying, well, you can essentially sue her because she only follows the law she's agreed with. Well, then you have the issue with, and she knows she has in her back pocket Supreme Court Justice Kyra Bolden, who she contributed $80,000 to her reelection campaign via a Pat Vincent controls while Justice Bolden was hearing arguments for the O'Halloran v. Benson case. And this is the type of rank and file corruption that we see. And this is what frustrates me, Pat. These people are it's criminal what they do, and they don't care. They don't care. They know they got the courts in their pockets. They know they have the law enforcement on their side. Other than Sheriff Darleaf, there is no county sheriff in the state of Michigan. We have 83 counties. Correct me if I'm wrong, it might be 84, but 83 counties in our state. And only one county sheriff is actually willing to do anything about the election crimes that we see in our state. And then the attorney general goes after him. And it's like all of our election activity is essentially futile because it's those who control the system determine the winner and not we the people. And I'm not saying that every elected official's race is in question, but it kind of draws a shot of some doubt. And it's like, if these people decide they want to rig an election, they can do it without impunity. What say you, Pat?
Well, it sounds like you're pretty comfortable with the status quo. I'm just kidding. No, it doesn't do any good to pass new laws if we're not going to enforce the ones that are currently on the book. And we got this contempt for the law is definitely a serious concern. I can tell you that not only did I point out her violation of the law and apparent bribery of a Michigan Supreme Court justice during my testimony, but I filed a complaint with the Attorney Grievance Commission against Jocelyn Benton, who's an attorney that's violating ethical standards. She should have lost her law license. They refused to investigate it, so I sent it up the chain to the Michigan Supreme Court. I appealed it there pro se. They said there's nothing here, so then I also filed a complaint with the Judicial Tenure Commission against Justice Bolden. She should be removed from the bench. Mm-hmm. You're right. To your point, there's nothing happened in this because it really is a systemic deep state corruption. And unfortunately, it's not an R versus D thing. It's just a corruption thing. The good news is we've actually got some good people, I believe, up in D.C. now. And so all those legal actions I took through state mechanisms, now we have federal authorities that have access to that information. And I know that in at least one of the incidents that I cited during the testimony here, we've actually got an attorney in the Department of Justice working on that case.
Well, that definitely brings some hope to the situation because, like you said, it's complete lawlessness. Pat, do you recall? I think it was after the 22 election when we went to look into the so in the state of Michigan through the MVIC system, you can reroute your absentee ballot to an alternate address. Do you recall when you got that data back, how there were multiple requests from the same individuals going to the same addresses? So they gave us a junk file. So the Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benton, she doesn't care about breaking the law. You're a former state senator, and in your testimony, you mentioned how you were vice chair of the Election and Government Reform Committee. So, by the way, for the audience who isn't aware, Pat's a rocket scientist. So you're not like this is some individual who doesn't know what's going on. And they send you back information that is the same individual multiple times requesting the same absentee ballots. And for folks who are unaware, you can go online and request an absentee ballot to go to an alternate address as long as you have certain information. So if I had your information, I can reroute your absentee ballot wherever I want. Now, here's the thing. What's interesting about that, for folks who forgot about 2000 Mules, that film, what was interesting is when you see these ballot mule operations, it's like, how did they get all these ballots? But it makes sense with the MVIC system, because if you have a bunch of fraudulent registrations, and then you know which registrations are fraudulent, you can just have the fraudulent registration ballots all routed to the same address, and then have the ballot mule fill them all out and dump them in the ballot drop box. I'm not a police officer. I'm just an average citizen, and it's not confusing to me at all how you can pull off a massive crime. And it's just like, we're supposed to move on, and everybody just have a nice day. And then, like you said, Pat, new laws will mean nothing. They don't even follow the existing laws. Because I remember when I was running for Secretary of State, and you were one of the people that helped in the campaign I was consulting with. And I remember calling you up one time like, Pat, here are all these new bills that they're proposing. And like you said, it's not an R versus D thing. It's a corruption thing. It's a deep state problem. So, because I was going through Michigan Compiled Law 168 that governs our election system. And so I'm like, Pat, we control, at the time we had control of both the House and the Senate as Republicans. And I'm like, they're proposing bills for this already existing law. You're like, oh yeah, that's a political bill. So that's just basically like dog food for the people, because most citizens are not reading state statute. So they just have, oh, Mr. So-and-so, I'm putting this bill. And
it's something to put on their campaign lit. Yeah, they pass bills that they can put on their campaign lit for the next election.
Pat, if our freedoms aren't, I laugh to stop from crying, because if our freedoms weren't on the line, this would be like a comedy skit. It would be comedy, but the consequences are dire. They're absolutely dire. What say you?
Well, absolutely. That's why I've been at this for over 5 years. I mean, if you include my time in the Michigan Senate, I had, I was oblivious to all how systemic the fraud was, frankly, during most of my tenure in the Michigan Senate. It wasn't until the 2016 election that one of my staffers oversaw the recount in the 2016 presidential election that was called for by Jill Stein. And they went out to Detroit, and they observed a precinct that had 306 votes being cast according to the statement of votes. But when you looked into the ballot container for that precinct, there were only 50 ballots. And that was just one of the 500 some precincts in the city of Detroit. And so I called for an investigation. The Secretary of State and Attorney General got a letter from me, a formal letter. Bill Schuette was the Attorney General at the time. He did nothing. But the Secretary of State, Ruth Johnson, did an investigation just based on electronic data she had available, because she didn't have subpoena authority or anything like that, like the Attorney General would have. And she, just with a cursory review of the data, found 31 counts of voter fraud, and there were 0 prosecutions coming out of it. Our current Attorney General makes a big deal out of 4 people in St. Clair Shores, whatever, that they say voted twice on it, and it's a big deal. Our Republican Attorney General, Bill Schuette, did nothing with 31 counts. So, that's kind of it's been going on for quite a while, and we still got a lot of work to do, but I'm more optimistic than ever that we're headed in the right direction finally.
Pat, it's funny you mentioned that about Dana Nessa, because we have video footage when she threatened me with a felony. When I was speaking at a Trump rally and I was talking about the election fraud, and Dana Nessa with Barb Bynum, I think the clown the Democrats are putting up to run for Secretary of State. I mean, this woman, anyway, she had some personal issues where she weaponized, it appears, I always say appears, she weaponized her position when her son was accused of sexual impropriety at his school. So again, it appears she weaponized her position, but nevertheless, they were doing a play-by-play analysis, if you will, like they were sports commentators of the rally. And Dana Nessa made the comment that I was potentially committing a felony by making the claims about election fraud because I was scaring people away from voting. So, I mean, these people are they're criminals. I know I sound nuts, but I firmly believe, based on my experience and observable information, that we have a secret criminal cartel running our state nation. Because
the evidence supports it. Yeah.
It's the only reasonable explanation.
Yeah, there's countless volumes of evidence that support that assertion. And I can tell you, I personally have gotten a 2 terabyte drive of evidence that we've collected over the last 5 years from meddling kids all over the place into the hands of folks in DC. So I think what you're starting to see now with the revelations coming out of Tulsi Gabbard, with some of the letters that are going out to secretaries of state from the Department of Justice, you're starting to see a renewed appreciation for the fact that, guys, we've been telling the truth since day one. Time to take it seriously. Let's dig into this. And anyway, there's good stuff happening.
Let me ask you, speaking of such, I saw you comment on X today about Jocelyn Benson getting a letter. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah. Well, President Trump's issued quite a few executive orders. And by the way, I should note that he's done it very publicly. In other words, there's no confusion as to whether or not he signed it via AutoPen or he signed it personally. He's been right there in front of the press when he's signing all these big executive orders. And one of the executive orders that he signed during this term of service is Executive Order 14248. And in that executive order, he calls for an investigation of the voter rolls in all the different states and whether or not the secretaries of state are complying with HAVA and the Help America Vote Act and the National Voter Registration Act. And they're asking for certain materials for the Department of Justice to go off and evaluate in context of that executive order. And if a state fails to comply with those requests for information, they move right to the top of the investigative list, which I have no doubt Benson is already there. And I'm sure she's not going to comply with them. But what they're doing is asking for copies of all their voter rolls, all their processes that they use to ensure the integrity of the voter rolls, examples of updates that they've done to clean the voter rolls, all the key metrics that they're following to go off and comply with the law. So this is kind of a big deal, and it kind of goes part and parcel with another executive order that President Trump put out in the first term, which is Executive Order 13873. While Executive Order 184248 focuses on the, or 14248 focuses on the voter rolls. It does touch a little bit on the electronic voting systems and upgrading the standards there. But his previous term, that Executive Order 13873, actually stated very clearly that we need to enforce existing law that prohibits the use of and the import of any systems for critical infrastructure components like our election systems that include components from foreign adversaries such as China. Mm-hmm. And we know from Dominion internal emails that for a fact that Dominion, their ImageCast precincts, which are tabulators found in every single precinct where Dominion is used, 48% of the components in those machines come from China. So these machines never should have been imported into the United States. They shouldn't have been used in our elections, according to current statute. And those are that's two of the key executive orders that President Trump has put in that, frankly, if we get enforcement of those two executive orders, and you don't have to pass any new laws, it's really just pointing you to new laws. I mean, it's pointing you to existing laws right now and just saying, guys, follow them. If you follow them, we should be able to secure our elections. That's what's happening right now, and that's where that DOJ letter to the Secretary of State came from.
Yeah, to your point, it's enforcement of existing laws. And as you mentioned earlier, Pat, the issue is systemic because it's all over America. A couple weeks ago, we had a gentleman on our show, Mr. Kevin Henry from Brazoria County, Texas. He had video footage of the county chair, Pat. You would have been jumping out of your seat if you had time to watch this footage, which I know you're too busy. But I mean, there's on camera, this guy is just carrying out a ballot bag. He's just opening it up, going in the bag. It's just like no type of security on the bag. Then he puts the bag in his car with a couple other people. And then these people are like driving down the road, trying to shake another person off, stopping on the side of the road, going 10 miles under the speed limit, attempting to turn down a dead-end road until they realize somebody's following them, going in the opposite direction of where there's, I mean, it's just, and this is all on camera. This isn't like this guy is just saying, and they don't care. They don't.
Well, you and I have a dear friend, Dr. Phil O'Halloran. If you remember in 2020, he took a photo of this guy in his Mercedes loading a bunch of boxes that appeared to be filled with ballots into the back of his car. And when Phil went up and started asking him what's going on here, the guy all of a sudden threw him into the back of the car, and sped off. So we know this is happening in broad daylight right out in front of everybody. And anyway, so it's not a mystery. It's just the only thing that's a mystery right now is why haven't they been held accountable? And which gets to the heart of this concept of a grand conspiracy, which highlights how the election fraud bones connected to the lawfare bone, connected to the money laundering bone, connected to the technology bone, connected to foreign adversaries. All that is connected, and it's very difficult to go off and sort it all out and get organized with it. And but that's what I'm working with Mike Lindell and others to go off and do.
To your point, Pat, like you said, it's so many layers to this. And then the average person kind of gets overwhelmed. And that's why I think this story is so important, because we cannot allow people to look at November 24 and say, job done, elections are secure. And people need to realize that this fight is ongoing. And so I do want to get to Mike Lindell's case, but I want to pick up a pause for about the CEO of Dominion. That is so interesting how this guy has been able to essentially use the American justice system as his own personal bat to suppress anyone who questions his practices. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, as somebody who received 2 love letters from Dominion and their lawyers saying cease and desist any discussion around Dominion, yeah, he's definitely been using lawfare to try to bludgeon people into silence. That's what they've been doing to folks like Patrick Byrne and also my friend Mike Lindell. And they're trying to get him shut up. And I'll tell you, the efforts of attorney Stephanie Lambert, who is an attorney for Patrick Byrne, to get evidence of criminal activity to Sheriff Darleaf, which, to your point earlier, is one of the only law enforcement officers, not just in Michigan, but frankly across the country, that's willing to go off and look into this stuff. Darleaf shared all these internal emails from Dominion that highlight that Dominion CEO John Polis was not telling the truth during his testimony under oath before the Michigan Senate. And just if you're keeping score, why is that so important? Because the testimony that John Polis provided formed the basis of the flawed Michigan Senate report. And flawed is putting it nicely.
Very nice.
And that Michigan Senate report has been used as evidence by the bad guys in pretty much every single election fraud case that I've read or evaluated. And I have to constantly reissue the same rebuttal every single time on this stupid Michigan Senate report, which was most sophomoric, unprofessional, disingenuous report that I've ever seen done. It was led by Republicans, Senator Ed McBroom, Senator Lana Tice, and Senator John Bison. And these are people that I knew, and they were in my Bible study together, and they never even. Ed McBroom reached out to me in response to some of the stuff, but Lana Tice, John Bison, nothing. They never had any questions.
I think about Ed McBroom. I think he thinks it's humorous. I think these people are so narcissistic and disgusting. I think he thinks it's funny, because in that report, he asked that the Attorney General, Dana Nessel, consider criminally investigating people who allege fraud in the election. That is unconstitutional. I have a right to redress grievances to my government. I have freedom of speech. But this is
you know what the response to that was?
Huh?
Yeah, that's why I got the 2 visitors from the Attorney General's office with their badges as special agents. So yeah, thank you, Ed. No, this is ridiculous. So yeah, the government has been weaponized against people that are not towing the line with the narrative they want to push. Yeah. And thankfully, we've got a lot of people like yourself and Mike and Patrick Byrne and Stephanie Lambert and Darleaf, all these fellow meddling kids that are standing up and saying, I don't care what you say. I know 2 + 2 = 4, and you're not going to convince me that it's 5.
You know what, Pat? Speaking of somebody that we really need to highlight is Tina Peters. Amazing. Tina Peters. Can you speak about her case? And are you aware of any activity or any movement to help her get out of prison?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind from election integrity activists like you and me, when you hear the name Tina Peters, say, well, okay, President Trump's president now. Why can't he just pardon her like he's pardoned everybody else that was wrongfully prosecuted. And the problem is Tina Peters was prosecuted under Colorado state statute and the Colorado court system, not under the federal system. So it has to be Colorado Governor Polis that has to issue the pardon. And myself and others have gone off and made a plea to him to do that, because she's currently serving a 9-year prison sentence for doing her job. Mm-hmm. And there's no other way of putting it there. She was preserving the integrity of the records. And in the process of doing so, she shared some passwords with a third party. Meanwhile, we've got Jenna Griswold, who's the Colorado Secretary of State, who's shared hundreds of passwords with the whole internet and not even a wrist slap. So it's a game of malicious prosecution. They want to make an example out of Tina. In regards to what the opportunities are, there was a recent court hearing this week seeking that was put forward by Peter Tickton, who's a lawyer for Tina. And what they're doing is making an appeal that Tina could be released on bond pending her appeal before the Colorado state court system. And the magistrate at the time, or magistrate judge, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't know what the formal title is. But anyway, this guy reviewed the testimony and didn't come to any conclusion. We know he's a rabid Trump hater, so that the odds of her getting a fair hearing, it just looks like they're slow walking it right now. And Tina's 69 years old. She's sitting rotten in prison with a bunch of people that did do some very, very bad stuff. Tina didn't do any bad stuff. She's a Gold Star mother, and we want to get her out of there. This was one legal avenue that they were pursuing to do that. This is also supported by the fact that the Department of Justice has issued a statement of interest in Tina's case, which is supported by evidence that Tina didn't get a fair trial, that she was being railroaded. If you look at some of the jury instructions that were given to by the judge, and also look at some of the evidence that was withheld from the jury in her trial, there's a strong case for her appeal. And in fact, and for the case that she did not get a fair trial within the Colorado court system. So when that happens, there are specific sections of federal law that in order to protect somebody's civil rights, if you got a whole state that's corrupt, which is the case in Colorado and frankly in many cases in Michigan as well, particularly when you get up to the Supreme Court level, it's tough to get justice done. And so when that happens, we've got a big brother up in DC that in this case, the big brother is good, not bad, and they can come in and help Tina. That doesn't happen very often. It's very rare, but it's definitely warranted in this case. And so we're hoping that will happen. And frankly, we're hoping for an expedited appeal inside the Colorado court system that allows that case to be dismissed against, or at least a sentence reduced for Tina Peters.
Yeah, and one of the things that people don't know is the way these individuals personally tormented Tina. They didn't just go after her publicly and throw her in jail. These people personally tormented this woman for years. I mean, imagine a Gold Star mom. During this whole process, her husband died. I mean, they tormented her in ways that most people couldn't imagine. And that's the challenge for a lot of citizens, is when you decide to stand up against this criminal cartel, they can destroy your life in ways you couldn't even imagine. They go after your family. It's absolutely awful. So it's good to hear that things are looking up for Tina, but of course it won't be really up until she's out of jail.
Yeah, we got to get her out of there.
There needs to be some accountability for the folks who persecuted her, because if anyone watched any bit of that trial, that judge was just hostile and hateful. He wasn't a judge who was an unbiased party, an objective party, simply listening to the state's case. He acted as though he hated this woman and wanted to make her pay. This is the type of evil that makes me remember why hell exists. And I'm not trying to be dramatic, but just to do that to another human being, it's just, us as Christians, it's just unthinkable. To do that to somebody all in the name of political persecution. He acted as though Tina Peters was some type of serious criminal, like a serial murderer or something like that, when she simply preserved election records to prove the facts that, actually, like you said, she was just doing her job. So it's not like she did anything wrong. But the fact that she had the evidence that our elections were rigged were too much for these people, because that evidence causes their house of cards to collapse, like the Antrim County situation.
Yeah, that gave us some very important information. They've been put out in a series of 4 reports called Mesa County reports, and they highlighted everything from the fact that they had 2 sets of books on the election to the fact that these were indeed connected to the internet. They had vulnerabilities, they had logs missing, all the usual suspects, and that indicate that, and not to mention the fact that Tina's core concern, which was that they would be deleting election records that it was her duty to preserve, they did that. So they actually deleted the whole chain of custody for the previous election, which was in question. They were doubting one of the local elections inside her jurisdiction, and so she had to preserve those records. So no, she's a hero, and the judge, to your point, was very adamant, saying, "You're no hero. You're the lowest of the low," and it would just it was definitely beyond the pale. And so, I mean, our prayers continue to be with Tina. My wife and I are praying for her every single night, and we're doing what we can to expose what's going on that led to that whole idea that she could be persecuted like that without consequence. And we're working on consequences for those who persecuted her, as well as those who persecuted folks like Stephanie Scott, who's a clerk out in Michigan, out at Adams Township, attorney Stephanie Lambert, attorney Rudy Giuliani. They pretty much took everything he owned. And then Sidney Powell, all these folks that have stood up and actually sought to help us, they were penalized. And by the way, this is no mystery. If Millie Weaver, right? You've seen Millennial Millie and some of her footage. So. Yeah, so she had a whistleblower come forward to her prior to the 2020 election that had all these Zoom calls with the leftists organizing the real insurrection prior to the 2020 election. And they would actually be planning with tactical maps where the police stations were, who was going to break the glass at the Capitol and get into government buildings, all this kind of stuff. There's all this information that's given the FBI, went nowhere. Well, one of the videos she shares is a simulation called the election simulation from one of these leftist groups. All the pronouns next to their name, right? Mm-hmm. And the election simulation showed a prominent Republican group as part of the simulation, making sure that any of President Trump's supporters or anybody questioning the election, the integrity of the election results, would get persecuted, so that they would have no future livelihood and no means of actually keeping the lights on at home. They were actually planning this well before 2020. So this isn't just a reaction. This is part of their hammer, if you will, to keep their narrative going. And Tina was caught in the crosshairs as others, has been Mike Lindell and others.
Can you speak to Mike? This is a good time to plug your book, The 2020 Coup, where you cover a lot of this information. Could you talk about Mike Lindell's case as well? Because he also faced some lawfare.
Oh, he's got lots of cases. So Dominion and Smartmatic are suing him for billions of dollars. And they're also suing his company, MyPillow, which MyPillow has nothing to do with any of this stuff. But anyway, he recently was sued by Eric Coomer, who is a senior developer, a guy in charge of security for Dominion, who was on record as saying that it's time to go shake the money tree and take out the pillow guy. And so it was a part of that lawfare, if you will. The guy's he's no longer working with Dominion, but he's making all this money off of lawsuits nowadays. And Mike, though, unlike a lot of the other lawsuits this guy engaged in, refused to settle, and he wanted to have a jury trial. And that jury trial was recently decided, and despite instructions issued by another, I would submit, not so just judge, a very biased judge, they essentially called, when he gave the jury instructions to the jury, said that Mike was guilty of defamation, and you're not supposed to be tipping the scales like that, and so Mike's got a case of appeals. But bottom line is, coming out of that case is that they found Mike liable for 2 statements that he made. One, they see before the election, and which was cited in their initial evidence. I mean, and then one which was made the day after he found out that Eric Coomer had sued him. Right, so he wasn't pleased at the time, and he let people know about it. And the real strange thing is that, first of all, the jury instructions were completely foobar. They were not. They were completely biased. They didn't include one of the statements of fact that was presented by the defense during the testimony, including the motivation of Eric Coomer, which was to shake the money tree and take out the pillow guy, and didn't highlight. I didn't highlight the fact that Eric Coomer was on the record as lying to law enforcement in an accident that he had previously. So the guy was proven to be a liar, but that wasn't admitted in the jury instructions. And in the final analysis, they cited Mike for those 2 counts and ordered him to pay $440,000. They completely exonerated My Pillow, much to the angst of Smartmatics and Dominion lawyers that were in the audience, because that's the whole basis of their court. They want to go after the shake the My Pillow money tree, and so there's another case where David Clements, I think, was provided a third comment that gave them the basis of suing Frank Speech, which is now defunct, and Mike has Lindell TV. So, but here's the real rub on all this. In a civil case, you're supposed to be able to the standard for prosecuting somebody and holding them accountable is that the preponderance of evidence supports your case. The plaintiff, in this case Eric Coomer, submitted over 150 samples of evidence in their initial filing, and out of those 150 samples of evidence, only one included anything that could be construed as a derogatory remark towards Eric Coomer by Mike Lindell. And yet, and all the rest of it was around the tried and not true garbage that they would throw in, like the Michigan Senate report by Ed McBroom and Lana Tice. It would put in the fake narrative that not one of the lawsuits have been successful. Heck, I got a Secretary of State in Michigan that was found by 7 courts to have issued unlawful guidance. And all the usual narratives that you constantly have to go off and debunk, and the people in the media keep repeating the lies all the time, and you got to debunk those lies. All the rest of those 150 pieces of evidence dealt with that kind of garbage, and so it's on appeal, and I don't think Mike's going to have to pay a red cent on this when it's all said and done.
That will be great if he doesn't. Yeah, it's just unbelievable, to your point of how much of it's an entire system they've developed, because as you know, these election machines, it's to me, it's really impossible to secure them. We have to have hand counting, but that's something that's not to say it's impossible. That's going to be so hard, because what we proved in 2022, when we had the state convention with 2,500 voters, and we were able to have them hand counted in 90 minutes, and you look at the average precinct, which is 6,000 voters, you can get those ballots counted within 3 hours. And it's in as you pointed out, I mean, things like vote totals being decimals. I do want to really quickly kind of go over a little bit of your testimony, just so people can understand just the nuts and bolts of how they're rigging the elections. Because as we stated affirmatively, the evidence, there's just a preponderance of evidence across America of the corruption, video evidence. I mean, it's just absolutely overwhelming. But I do want to hit on a few points from your testimony, where you talked about basically the anatomy of the election system, and you showed the picture of the map you created, which you gave me a like a life-size map. It's like as large as me, like it is stretched out in the star of our whole election system. This is way overly complicated, and it creates so many potential failure points for fraud and corruption to be injected. But you broke down our election system. Please correct me if I'm wrong in this, but you broke it down to number of voters, ballots cast, list of voters, ballots cast, vote records, and election results. And you kind of broke it down into those categories of areas of focus, while maintaining chain of custody and consistency across those. Am I correct on that?
Yeah. Essentially, I took the whole ocean and boiled it down into a little pond and said, all right, if you can't track everything that's going on there, just focus on these six, I think it was 6 election records. And if these election records are all singing from the same sheet of music and telling the same story, you got reason to believe that you conducted the election with some integrity.
And so how exactly, in your opinion, are they corrupting these various elements? And I think that's important just for the viewers who kind of are aware that our elections are corrupt but don't quite understand. Could you talk about how they're carrying out the corruption in these various elements?
Oh, there's so many different mechanisms that they use, and they literally been refining this through decades. But here's a couple examples. In the book, The 2020 Coup, I broke it out into 4 basic phases of the operation. Number 1 was preparation. And by preparation, I talk about the fact that they're seeding the qualified voter file with ineligible voters, hundreds and thousands. I mean, if you look at what Ruth Johnson said during in a private letter to her Senate colleagues in the Republican caucus, she highlighted that over 800,000 ineligible voters were sitting in the qualified voter file after she had purged those voters when she served as Secretary of State just a year earlier. So this is kind of a big deal. That's what they do during preparation. Other thing is lawfare, which is what they did with Priorities USA versus Benson. Benson used a friendly lawsuit from Priorities USA and Mark Elias and all his cronies, and Benson used that lawsuit as a basis for going around the legislature and stating, you know what, in order to make this fair, we're just going to have to get rid of signature verification on these absentee ballots, and which is against the law, and she was held accountable, but not until after the election. Yeah. So 3 months after the election, I should point out, I think, if I remember right. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. And the electronic voting systems themselves, that's something that's done before, part of the preparation. This is how they get advanced intel into how the election's being conducted, and they give privileged access to their friends and like these NGOs that received all this money from groups like the USAID and all those folks. These guys had privileged access to these election records, and then you had organizations like the Center for Internet Security that were effectively doing wiretaps of all these election systems in all 50 states under the guise of providing election security. So that's part of that preparation phase. That's just teeing up the battlefield. The second, and they're doing that right now in preparation for 2026. They're trying to pass ranked choice voting on the 2026 ballot. And to your point earlier, you said their goal is just to make this as complicated as possible. A way to introduce ranked choice voting. Nobody is going to figure out who won an election. You're just going to trust the algorithm is what we're going to be told. So we got a lot of work there. But here's the primary mechanism that they're using for fraud, and it's via mail-in ballots, absentee ballots. It's a third-party transaction, which means that it's conducted by everybody except for the voter. In many cases, the voter trusts that the ballot that they put into the mail actually goes to somebody to read and insert into the ballot, into the tabulator, and that it actually gets counted. There's a lot of ifs, or things that we're trusting in all along the process that are different than if you go in and vote in person. And so one of the things that you can do is leverage things like corrupt databases, like a qualified voter file with 800,000 ineligible voters. Well, the bad guys know who the ineligible voters are. They're low propensity voters. All they have to do is assign a name to a ballot so that at the end of the day, they can kind of get in the ballpark on whether or not the number of ballots correspond to the number of voters that they put into the poll book. And then they pass that first sniff test, if you will, on the integrity of the election, which is why I talk about maintaining consistency across 6 records. They only want you to focus on 2, the number of ballots and the number of voters. And so that's the primary mechanism. And kind of in a nutshell, what you saw in 2000 Mules is essentially the primary election fraud mechanism. Now, in order for that to be effective, the bad guys have to predict accurately what the voter turnout in election is going to be, because all this stuff ostensibly is they have to predict the number of ballots that they need to insert by precinct for each candidate, whatever the case it may be. And based on that turnout, they need to have enough friendly ballots in there to get enough of a percentage of vote to carry the day. If they fail to predict that voter turnout accurately, they have to go to a backup plan. That backup plan is the voting machines themselves and direct manipulation of the vote. And in support of that, we've seen the fact that we call it the Edison resets at 3 o'clock. I think it's 3 o'clock in the morning. It's 5 o'clock in the morning, I think, in Michigan, at different times in different states all across the country. But there was a notable drop in the official cumulative vote tally, which the cumulative vote tally should never go down to zero. But what it indicates is that there was some sort of control system implemented that had to do a little recalibration move in the middle of the night. And if you adjust the vote tally, what do you got to do? You got to adjust the ballots that you have injected into the system, right? So that if somebody did a recount, you'd be able to pass a sniff test and say, oh, yeah, here's a number of ballots that correspond to this vote injection that I did via the machine. And guess what happened at 3:30 in the morning at TCF Center, right? So we saw them drop off tens of thousands of ballots without any chain of custody. And if now you've got the vote tally bone connected to the ballot bone, now you got to go off and make sure that the poll book bone passes the sniff test. And so in order to do that, what they did is a day before they're going to certify the results in Wayne County, they came in with brand spanking new poll books. And so what we're seeing is evidence to suggest that they did do this backup attack, which starts with the machines, but you got to do the overall paper trail. And because there's so many moving parts in it, you've got to make sure that's your fraud of last resort, because it's more easy to be discovered, and we discovered it. And so that's phase 3. Phase 4 is what we call the defense phase, which is designed to prevent you from talking about any of the other 3 phases. That's where they issue the lawfare threats. That's where they go off and obstruct you. They deny you the ability to get justice via the court system, and they put out fact checkers against you and deplatform you and try to cut you off at the knees. So 4 basic phases: prep phase, mail-in ballot fraud, machine-based fraud, then the defense phase.
Pat, it just got me thinking when we were at the TCF Center, and that really changed my life, because I had always been an active Republican, because I just knew, just as a Christian, my civic duty does not end at the ballot box. It just doesn't, But when I was at the TCF Center, and my reason for going was when our buddy Bob Cushman gave an interview regarding the corruption he saw during the August primary. And also I saw some shady things during the March presidential primary in 2020 that just didn't add up, when people were coming in to vote and the e-poll book had crashed. And they told the people they could fill out their application to vote, fill out their ballot, and put their ballot into a little slot on the side of the machine. It could tabulate it later. And I thought to myself, I was standing behind the election workers as a poll watcher, and the poll book really did go down. So those folks weren't making it up. But I'm thinking to myself, and they called down to the clerk's office multiple times and got no answer. This is in the city of Detroit. And I was thinking to myself, like, if somebody wanted to not feed those ballots, or if those ballots just happened to forgotten about, that process did not add up to me. So to make a long story short, when we were at the TCF Center, Pat, my mind was blown. I was there for 37 hours. I was not expecting to, I just was shocked. And when those ballots showed up in the middle of the night, and this is the crazy part about the ballot showing up in the middle of the night. So the Republican attorney that was there, he said to me, he's like, you sit in that chair, don't let another ballot come through that door. Now, fast forward to the media reporting, no ballot showed up in the middle of the night. And this was kind of like the impetus for me to run for Secretary of State. I'm thinking, like, they're telling the public that no ballot showed up in the middle of the night, and I watched it happen.
I know. It wasn't until Gateway Pundit came out with the surveillance video that people started believing us.
And then, like, I recall the gentleman who was overseeing the Detroit counting board, and you were saying to him, it's connected to the internet. And I'm sitting here watching this all transpire. And God, like, no, it's not, Senator. And you're like, yes, it is. It's connected to the internet. And then they come out and say, there was no internet connection. I'm like, I have never in my life been so gaslit, So for us, it was more frustrating because we watched it happen. Remember Charlie LaDuff? We had the video footage where he cursed me out because all I pointed out was the ballots were did show up in the middle of the night because he was their guy, because he had that reputation of being, the cowboy boot wearing no nonsense journalist. So they used him to give credibility to their lie. And when his lie was exposed, what did he do? His drunk behind just sat there and cursed me out. We got it on camera, so the whole thing was just it's so unbelievable that you can have no other conclusion that it is a secret criminal organization operating in our country, because it's too complicated for this stuff to happen. Because for it to happen simultaneously, systemic election corruption to happen simultaneously, nationally, surgically, if we're going to be able to cover it up and be on message nationally all at once, like, can't be just some haphazard boys and girls here and there carrying it out. And kind of to your point, Pat, one thing I do want to ask you about Edison reporting, because people need to understand that makes zero sense how our elections are reported. But also, really quick, when you talk about, in your testimony, you mentioned like the smoke and mirrors. Before we get to the Edison test, so don't let me forget that, but the Edison reporting, excuse me. But the smoke and mirrors they do, so they have like these fake little performances where they pretend like they're being transparent, but they're really not. One is the public accuracy test, and the other is the risk limited audit. Yeah. I'm like ready, like run down the street. It's so ridiculous because the public accuracy test, they don't even test. Oftentimes, they never even test all the machines they're using. They just test a sample. So they'll test one or two machines.
And the machines they test are never used in support of the election. It's complete smoke and mirrors.
Pat, and they tell us, well, we're testing similar models. What does that have to do with that? I mean, you could get a 7-year-old has enough sense to know, well, testing that machine doesn't mean this machine is going to work. I mean, even if the models are the exact same, this one can have a glitch.
And the core issue is the ballot style. So every single one of those precincts, or a large percentage of them, had different ballot measures on them. So the whole idea of testing is to make sure that a given ballot scans the results and puts it in the appropriate vote tally bin. You're testing 12, sometimes 14 tabulators, and there's no way you can get 503 ballot variations in those tabulators. It's just not the way it works. So anyway.
And to your point, Pat, this is the problem. And I hope people really watch and share this episode. They play on the public's ignorance. And I don't mean that as an insult.
And the legislative ignorance, like McBroom and Tice and Bison.
Mm-hmm. They play on their ignorance and the public. And then, folks, I'm not trying to be insulting. I'm just saying the lack of knowledge. They intentionally keep the knowledge away from us of how our elections work. They overly complicate it, so most people have no idea how our elections work. That way they can engage in all kind of corruption and smoke and mirrors, and you are none the wiser. To add insult to injury, Pat, the risk limited audit. If you could explain... It's so, because I remember when I was running for Secretary of State, even before my announcement, I was on this massive like investigative train. And so when I watched the video of the risk limited audit, I'm like, you got to be kidding me. That's it? And Benson will get on camera and go, we've conducted 700, however many, we've conducted all these audits. Could you please explain to the audience how a risk limited audit operates and just the nonsense of it all, please?
All right. First of all, there are over 5 million ballots cast in the 2020 election. In the risk limiting audit that Jocelyn Benson said she conducted, there were 18,000 ballots evaluated. And in that context, it was just a glorified recount. It was not an audit. When you talk about an audit, I don't know, you've ever been audited by the IRS? I have been. And they're not asking you to redo your math on your 1040. They're asking for you to show the receipts. This risk limiting audit doesn't require you to show any receipts. It literally is not even a recount in many cases, because they're only looking at 1 or 2 ballots per precinct. It's a complete joke. And here's the rub of it, right? They don't even do recounts in the city of Detroit, which is the largest. 8% of the votes cast in the 2020 election came from the city of Detroit. They monitored 0 precincts, 0 ballots during their risk limiting audit in the city of Detroit. As a matter of fact, the whole system's rigged to preclude investigation of any large cities in the risk limiting audit. So that's something actually I discovered a little bit recently as I was digging into the details of this. And I was amazed that actually came out like that. Now, when we want an audit, we want the whole paper trail, because when you're recounting these ballots, you want to make sure that the ballot wasn't cast by somebody, let's say like Jason Lemoyne Daniel, who's a 170-year-old Civil War veteran. Literally, that guy voted in the 2020 election in Flint, Michigan. So that shouldn't be happening. How does that happen? This risk limiting audit doesn't address anything like that. It's just so public accuracy tests are complete smoke and mirrors. Risk limiting audit is complete smoke and mirrors. And while we're on the topic of smoke and mirrors, guess what they did recently to the TCF Center?
Oh boy, what?
They did some remodeling. And you remember the back door that we saw the van pull in and drop off all those ballots in the middle of the night? They've now put up a fake wall in front of that so that you can't see them opening the gate in the back of the TCF Center.
Oh my! Oh my God!
And not only that, but they had a 5-step process for every one of those AV county boards when we were there, right? The first step was validating that this was a valid voter. And that's where we had all the issues where they were entering in people with birth dates of January 1st, 1900, right? That is no longer performed in front of poll challengers. They took that process and put it back at the Elections Bureau for the city of Detroit. So the poll challenger is useless, frankly, in the city of Detroit under the current process of what they allow them to go off and look at. And if that wasn't enough, they've effectively outlawed poll challengers due to legislation that the Democrats passed since then as well.
Yeah, and it makes me think of like even the nonsense where if the precinct doesn't balance, you can't recount it. And they'll just intentionally screw up the count at the precinct level so you can't recount it. Or where they really get gangster, if you will.
Which kind of makes sense, by the way. I'll push back just a second because there's no good solution on this, frankly. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't in this context. So the fact that you can't recount, okay, I get it. But how do you know whether or not you're looking at real ballots or the ballots that were there at the time? So if the seal's broken, I get it, right? Or if it's not balanced, I get it. But the opposite approach isn't good either. And some people put forward, well, I just want to have a direct traceability to my ballot to make sure that it got counted. And that implies that you're going to have to use some barcode to track your ballot. When that happens, people will know what your vote was and you lose the secret ballot. So there's no good solution to that except having people with integrity managing our operations, which pretty much disqualifies Jocelyn Benson and Jonathan Brader. A
lot of them. And then Pat, also to that point is where they get really gangster is if you want to see the county aggregation. They won't let anybody see. As you know from experience, they won't let anybody see the ballot aggregation at the county level. So that should tell the citizenry, like, folks, we got to get active. If they don't want you to see how they're aggregating the votes at the county level, that means they are clearly doing something illegal.
Yeah. They lie. I mean, I as you know, out in Wayne County during the August 22 primary, I went to Wayne County. Braden Giacobazzi was there with me for a while, but I said, nothing's happening here. They wouldn't allow us in to oversee the county count and county aggregation of the votes. So, but I stayed there. I stayed there till about 11:30 at night because the narrative was that none of these machines were connected to the internet. Remember that? And so I sat there and I've got I had to sue to get the surveillance video that proved all this because I was by myself at the time. But I eventually got the surveillance video and made Wayne County pay a penalty for the obfuscation. But what I was noticing is that the official story was that they would bring in their flash drives in a sealed envelope and then take that sealed envelope into the server room at the county and then insert it into the server, and then that would upload the results to the internet so we could see what the election results were. That was the official narrative. That is not what I observed. And So I would see the communities come in, like Grosse Pointe would come in and have their envelope. They'd take the envelope, put it into a mail bin behind the desk. Meanwhile, I'm looking on my phone and I'm doing a refresh of the Wayne County election results. And I'm seeing all these communities listed that had not brought in any flash drives at all. And their results were being posted. And I can hear in the room, I can't see, but I can hear in the room that they're saying, Van Buren Township just uploaded. Well, that's code for internet connection and the fact that they were doing this remotely. So they're lying through their frickin' teeth. And to add insult to injury, during that whole time, I had 2 agents from the Attorney General's office monitoring me to see if I did anything that they could charge me with. I had a deputy county sheriff that was there to make sure I wouldn't go into the counting area. And I had 2 Detroit police officers from the tactical unit came in that when I heard them talking, they said, doesn't look like there's any disturbance to me. So somebody had obviously called in a false police report. And whenever I tried to get evidence of that police report through the FOIA process later, it never existed. These police officers never arrived. That tells me that these guys are dirty as hell, and they've got it at all levels of government, and it's frustrating.
It is.
Oh, and one extra thing I noticed, when I finally got the surveillance video, one thing I noticed was that, during the election there, remember, this is August of 2022, you were required to wear the stupid face diapers. And if not, they'd be escorting you outside of the building. So I, of course, had to wear it if I was going to go off and monitor what was going on with the elections. Well, when I watched the surveillance video, I noticed that they stopped wearing masks after I left the building. That tells me that they were using that just as a mechanism an excuse to get rid of oversight of the elections. So it's just
this gets into really, because I know we got to wrap up. We're a little bit over time, but I have to. Your book, Wrestling Gators, for the audience to see. Pat, this book is a classic. After your time serving in the Michigan Senate, you wrote this book for the average person to understand just how corrupt the process is. So I asked you before the show if I could bring it up because I didn't want to put you on the spot. But to me, your own personal experience, folks know about my experience with MyGOP. I've talked about it extensively. But when you were serving in the Michigan Senate, the Senate Majority Leader, Arlen Meekoff, brandished a gun and challenged you to a duel on the floor of the Senate. This is your own fellow Republican.
Not on the floor of the Senate, in a caucus room.
Caucus room, I apologize. Could you?
Yeah, we probably would have had a few reporter cameras on it if it was out there, not on the floor of the Senate. I mean, that is monitored by video. I would have definitely have sought the surveillance video for that one.
But could you? I think that story is important because it really goes to our point to what we are up against. And when a couple weeks ago, I had Abraham Hamilton III on the show, and he was like, this isn't political gangbanging where it's the Reds versus the Blues. We have to really get out of that mindset. Yes, I am a Republican, but that does not mean that we just fall in line, because my first allegiance is to Jesus Christ and my family after that. And then the U.S. Constitution. That's where my allegiance lies. And my party allegiance is contingent upon their behavior. So can you speak to that story, simply because that really is an excellent example as to when, we have a nickname for you, I'm sure you're aware of. We call you St. Pat, because you're a man who's known for having high integrity. You're known for having high integrity. So that's the truth. But the reason why it's important is because when Christians enter into the political space, we are met with such resistance. And, I've heard people say, and I completely agree, that the Republican Party treats Christians the way the Democrat Party treats Black folks. It's that they love to have us voting. They want us praying at their prayer breakfasts. Yeah. They want us at our events. But as soon as we bring our faith in Christ into the political arena, it's like, oh, no. You can't do that. So could you share that story and your experience, please? I know we got to wrap it up, but.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was my second term in the Michigan Senate. My first term, we were passing all kinds of really bad legislation, like Medicaid expansion under Governor Snyder. And at the time, I pulled a procedural move to prevent the Lieutenant Governor, Brian Calley, from passing Medicaid expansion, because if there's a 19-19 tie on the Senate floor, then the Lieutenant Governor gets to be the deciding vote. Well, even though I was present, I decided not to vote, which made it 1918, which means he couldn't vote for it, which means it didn't have the requisite 20 votes to pass, which means that Medicaid expansion did not pass for about 3 hours. Well, suffice it to say, my colleagues, including Senator Meekhoff, who had to file for the motion to reconsider the vote, didn't appreciate that, and it put a burr in his saddle. So when it came down to my second term, they made sure I was the only returning senator that did not have any chairmanships at all. They essentially marginalized the heck out of me however they possibly could, which just gave me, frankly, more time to go off and investigate other pursuits. So it was not a big deal from my perspective. But so there's some bad blood apparently, and I wasn't even aware of it at the time with Arlen Meekhoff and myself. So it all culminated in a case where, the Republicans at the time, I think it was Sandy Hook and a bunch of school shootings were out there. And so Arlen Meekhoff went out and got all his pollsters together and started crafting legislation based on polls. And I spoke up in caucus and I said, well, guys, that may be pulling at 80, this gun control legislation you're pushing may be pulling at 80%, but that's because we haven't spoken up and talking about why that's bad and how the exact opposite of that is better. So don't give me all this fake polling. I said, we need to go off and make the case for why our Second Amendment right to bear arms should be supported. And we took an oath to support that. That was part of our oath of office. And in Michigan, it's even clear. In Article 1, Section 5, I think it is, or 6, we have a right to bear arms in self-defense. And so he was pushing back on all that. I mean, this is like the red flag laws and all this other garbage that the Democrats ended up putting in later. And so when I said that, he said, "You're just doing that because you're running for governor, Colbeck." And I go, "No, if I was doing it because I was running for governor, I'd be with you on the 80% polling, right? Because I'd want that for the upcoming election." That's not the case at all. And he got upset because a lot of my colleagues were nodding their head saying Colbeck's making a lot of sense. And I wasn't in his face on it. I was just reasoning. I'm just trying to do logic. And that's when he brandished his firearm and challenged me to a duel in front of 25 other senators in our caucus room. And sadly, all my colleagues did at the time was lean back to get out of the line of sight between him and me. And all I could think of at the time is that, sorry, but I'm not willing to channel my inner Alexander Hamilton. And for those of you who don't recall, Alexander Hamilton got killed and shot by Aaron Burr during a duel. So.
And this to me speaks to the unreasonable level of power that Senate Majority Leaders and House Speaker have, because the fact that the rest of your colleagues were such cowards to not call him out and chastise him and take necessary steps, if possible, to remove him from a position. Because when you get to the point where you're brandishing a weapon, and that is like next level danger. I mean, what if he accidentally shot you or somebody else in the process? And you can't just be doing that because you're mad because you won't listen to me. But this is how these people are. They're a bunch of entitled narcissists, and they'll tell you they're Christian. By the way, they'll say they're
Arlen. Yeah.
Yep. Like you said, some of these people go to the prayer breakfast. I've now learned a lot of these people. I actually have my stomach hurts because they're just so disgusting. But anyways, Pat, I want to respect your time. I have enjoyed this interview. I so appreciate you sticking to this fight. Continue to fight for election integrity. God bless you. Just thank you for all that you do. Do you have any closing comments before we say goodbye?
Well, I'm always asked by people, what can we do? So we hear all these problems, everything that's going on. Here's something very tangible you can go off and do right now, which is help President Trump get his executive orders enforced. Go to lindellplan.com and click on the call to action up on the top. And it'll provide some steps that you can go through to help President Trump get his executive orders enforced. And essentially, we're calling on people to send letters to the heads of all the electronic voting system companies, to the National Association of Secretaries of State, and to the Election Assistance Commission, say, what are you doing to comply with the executive order? And all that information, we'll collect it. We'll make sure friends up in Department of Justice get all that information, and then we'll see where to proceed from there. But we really got to get these executive orders pushed forward. If we do, got a reasonable reason to believe that we can secure the 2026 election.
All right. Thank you so much, Pat, for joining me. And everyone, thank you for joining the Karamo Report. I hope you enjoyed the episode. And please follow his instructions and get active. Don't just sit and complain. Take this information, share it with your friends and family, and get active. And make sure you visit thekaramo.report.com. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe this episode. And if you feel so inclined, give a generous contribution. As you know, it costs to run this show. So thank you so much, and God bless.